Okay, perfect. Roberta, I'll go ahead and start introducing you while you share your screen, if that's okay. Perfect. All right. Um, Welcome, Roberto. He is an adjunct lecturer and doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Icelandic and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Iceland. And his areas of interest are historical linguistics, manuscript studies, folklore, and magic. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Lovely.
Yeah.
Let me open my slides again. I wasn't sure that my mic was on. Okay. You see
Perfect.
the
We can see
slides?
them. Yeah.
Lovely. So I would like to start my presentation, which is going to be a little bit rushed, I'm afraid, because I have a lot of things that I would like to tell you. So I apologize in advance. Um, these galdrastafir, so the symbols themselves, I would like to focus on them because they have kind of exploded in pop culture in recent years. They have become very popular, for example, for tattoos. A lot of people have used them. The Ægishjálmur in particular, the helms of Ó or the Vegvísir, the Wayfinder. They appear often in association with runes, and it's a very old theory that they actually originated from bind runes, and then they became progressively more complex. The problem with that interpretation is that we never seen the intermediate passages in the manuscripts. They sort of appear all of a sudden in late medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, and so that interpretation of their origins is a bit unsatisfactory, so to speak. So looking more carefully, it looks like they actually belong to a European tradition. And looking a little bit here and there, one finds very interesting similarities in European grimoires, as Kauri has already mentioned. Scholars have noticed, for example, that there are quite a lot of similar symbols in the Hygromandia, this magical treatise of Solomon, which is a Byzantine 15th century manuscript, which is part of a tradition of Solomonic magic that starts in Europe in the Middle Ages. It goes back much further than that. It's a tradition that starts from a pseudo-epigraphical text that talks about King Solomon that gets a magical ring. Well, magical is probably not the best word, but he gets a ring from God that gives him the power to bind demons and use them for good purposes, such as building the temple. So what happens is that from this idea, a whole magical tradition develops. It's called the Goetia. And there's plenty of magical books in Europe that start to spread, especially from the 14th century, that give instructions on how to prepare the ritual in order to control demons. And the ritual allows the magician to bind the demons by the use of magical seals. And the magical seals that we see in manuscripts from Italy, especially, this is mostly Mediterranean, Italian/Greek tradition. They really resemble the later galdrastafir that appear in Iceland starting from the end of the 15th century. So the timing also matches in that sense. I recently found by chance some further similarities. So on the left, you see a screenshot from an Italian manuscript. It's the oldest that we know of that is complete. It's in Italian. It's in Paris right now, Italian 1520-24. And you see that there are some seals there. And we find similar seals in the earliest Icelandic grimoire that we know of, which is not actually a grimoire, it's a leech book, but there are magical things included there. They're kind of hidden in between the more medicinal things. So you see, for example, that there is lava written here. Lava, there is also in the Italian manuscript. Agla, there is also agla here. It's a very small, I don't know if you can see it there. Yeah. And this is the same manuscript that I showed you earlier. I now completely screw this. Let me see. Yeah, there. So this is the corpus of the earliest Icelandic grimoire. There is the one that Kauri has talked about. I didn't really include that one in my study because it looks like it's a bit more like a localized Icelandic tradition, although external influences from Europe are not to be ruled out entirely, I would say. This is the oldest one on the left, Lækningakver. It's from around 1500, and it presents the first few galdrastafir. Then we see the full-blown ones in the Stockholm Galdrabók and in the Galdrakver, which is in Reykjavik. And it's the first one that has the Ægishjálmur in the form that has become most popular today and is used in tattoos and all that. So as I said, there is a Solomonic origin to these symbols. Um, it's very difficult to prove that. However, the similarities are only superficial in the sense that the designs look compellingly similar, but it's very difficult to trace the transmission, and that's been a problem that I kind of grappled with for many years. Like, how do we prove the link between European continental Solomonic magic and the Icelandic galdrastafir? Um, Aside from the similarities that are quite compelling, we need something more, or at least we need to explain how we got from these Mediterranean symbols to the Icelandic galdrastafir. Also, because the context in which they appear is slightly different. Because in the European grimoires, these symbols are just one small part of the entire process of binding demons. There is a ritual of purification. You need to create special tools like a knife and all that. And the seal is just a small element. Whereas in Icelandic magic, the seals become central. So yes, there are these visual parallels. Here on the top, you can see some note from another magical tradition from Europe, the Ars Notoria. These were not actually they were not thought as a mean to control demons. They were special symbols that were used to create, like, memorize things, basically. They were a sort of mnemonic device in a magical sense, and you got the help of angels to memorize things as you were tracing the symbols. So there are also some practical similarities in the performance. As you can see, there are also visual similarities there. There are these forks, for example, circles. There is radial symmetry here and there. So the visual and stylistic parallels are definitely there. However, the change that we see in the practical use, is probably something that is best explained with a process of vernacularization, meaning that the European tradition of the demonic seals was something that mostly priests and educated people practice, and that's why it was a very highly ritualized and complex tradition. In Iceland, what we see is that some elements of that tradition are kind of removed, and the result is a more simplified branch of the same traditions. And the symbols become magical tools in themselves rather than simple signatures or small elements in a much more complex ritual. A scholar, Klassen, called this illicit learned magic. So it's this magic that was not allowed, that was forbidden in some ways, that gets kind of squeezed in something more, let's say, medical, for example, like we saw in Lækningar, and it gets used for all sorts of purposes by farmers, students, craftsmen, and it becomes much more simple. So, for example, in the Icelandic manuscripts, most of the time, tracing a symbol in some way is more than enough to achieve a particular means. So there is no ritual of purification, there is no magical tool to be used. You just need to use maybe saliva, blood, oak, lead, but things that were available to the everyday person. And another element that points to vernacularization is that you often find spelling mistakes, especially in the transcription of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin names. It's clear that people were kind of trying to imitate a learned tradition, but they didn't always do a very good job at that. So in the continental grimoires, the sigils are clearly surrounded by a more complex ritual. The Icelandic ones are self-contained, so they are sufficient. So the power is transferred from the ritual to the symbol itself. And one of the reasons why we see this may be Lutheran orthodoxy. So especially in the modern period, there is the sort of beginning of what will end up in the modern age as the witch craze. There is this obsession with the demonic powers being abroad in the world and conferring magical power to individuals that make a pact with the devil. So the Icelandic tradition of removing the demons from the game, let's say, maybe also a reflection of that, like lay people messing around with this occult knowledge, but trying to shelter themselves from accusations of heresy, I would say. Now, a huge problem that I faced over the years while I was trying to study the development of this galdrastafir was the divergence. So, coming from a background in philology, I made tables on Excel, copying and pasting galdrastafir, trying to see if it was possible to reconstruct a sort of stemma like we would do, for example, for a saga manuscript. So, tracing variation and try to reconstruct a family of galdrastafir, identifying purposes and intents and all of that, and shapes, of course. And then I realized later on that that was simply not the way to go, because these are not sagas. When people were copying galdrastafir of magical books, they were not trying to preserve a tradition. They were actually trying to put together something for their personal usage. And in that sense, the similarity that I could think of that best explains this is the cookbooks of today. We all have, or many of us have, a notebook and we write into it recipes that we have seen or heard somewhere. But like we live in Iceland, so we don't always have all the ingredients that we need. So we modify some of the ingredients and substitute them with something that we have locally. And this is what we see in these grimoires. And this is not something that is unique to Icelandic grimoire. The problem of reconstructing the tradition of Solomonic grimoires is ubiquitous. So scholars that are trying to reconstruct the textual history of the Clavicula Salomonis, the magical key of Solomon, they also lament the problem that it's very difficult to compare the manuscripts and reconstruct a stemma because they are all so different from one another, because they were not copied with the intent of copying the whole text. They were just built anew every time, taken from different sources. So in that context, it's very difficult to trace a genealogy. So the aim was whatever the person needed to do at any particular point in their life. Was it, to harm enemies, to protect themselves from enemies, from external forces, and whatever they needed, they put together in these magical books that then were passed on to us. So there was no need of textual coherence. They were a bit of a random collection of spells. So the cultural and historical significance of this is that the galdrastafir are not something that came up out of nowhere in Iceland. They were definitely not an evolution of ancient runes or anything like that. They are part of a broader tradition that acquires, however, different characteristics in a peripheral context, that is in Iceland, and they represent a bridge, a connection between the Mediterranean learned magic and Icelandic folklore. I hope that I am not using all my time, but okay, excellent. I rushed so much. Sorry, I was afraid that I wouldn't have enough time. But yeah, to conclude, we can analyze these magical symbols, the galdrastafir, as peripheral Salomonica. That is, they are definitely part of the Solomonic tradition. King Solomon is actually named a few times. There are Solomonic seals. The sigil of Solomon or the key of Solomon is mentioned in the Icelandic grimoires themselves. So that's pretty uncontroversial, I would say. And they represent a sort of localized, de-mythologized and popularized form of learned ritual magic. I should also mention that even later Icelandic magical books, let's say from the 18th century and early 19th century, in those we see that this process of removal of the demonic aspects is complete. So the oldest ones that we observe, they still represent a sort of transitional phase by which we find the invocations of demons, the use of nomina sacra, so sacred names of God himself, angels and demons and all that. But we already start seeing a few galdrastafir that are self-contained and sufficient. And this is just the beginning. By the 19th century, we see that the demons have basically disappeared, and we have the typical stereotypical, maybe I should say, Icelandic galdrastafir, by which, okay, you trace this symbol and you get this effect. So this illustrates a process of vernacularization, cultural diffusion, and creative adaptation. So how a tradition that started in the Mediterranean spread out, and from the higher strata of society, from educated and learned circles, percolated down into the vernacular, into the folk elements, and became something new, if you will, and creative here in Iceland. So thank you very much.